let's begin. If you get a little cool, it's because the wind's blowing. But there should be some body language out here that would signal the speakers to go faster if in fact they're going past their 5 minutes. But, Larry?
If we didn't have such an elaborate introduction, we could have been done. No, I made a few notes that I would be quicker this time than I was last time. And the Iron Age is usually thought of from 1200 BC to 586, or the destruction of the temple. But normally we go on down to around 330 or so to the Hellenistic period. Boy, that bell is so much more interesting than what's that? Flying sunshine. Okay. So, to repeat myself, 1200 to 586, traditionally, fall of Jerusalem, but we usually extend it on down to 330, Hellenistic period. So, Persian period is thought of as Iron 3. And then how to divide up the rest of the period is an interesting question. Traditionally, Americans have started around 1200 and gone down to the destruction that Shishak, the Egyptian pharaoh, wrought in many sites in Palestine in the 10th century. And that was Iron 1. But I think most Israelis, and correct me if I'm wrong, go down to just the first couple hundred years for Iron 1 and put the United Monarchy in what they call Iron 2A, and then the rest of Iron 2 BC in the United Monarchy. So there are many and confusing ways to divide up the Iron Age. In fact, over on the other side, they call the Bronze Age the Canaanite period, and the Iron Age the Israelite period. But it's really dangerous to get into these ethnic terms for periods, and even though the Bronze, Stone, Iron Age terminology is really inadequate, it's still something that probably is more neutral and preferable. It's the end of imports in pottery, that transition around 1200. Remember that the late Bronze has lots of imports, Iron 1 doesn't. Iron is brought into general use during Iron Age, although Iron 1, there's really not that much iron. In the Philistine area, maybe, but you know the stories in the Bible about how the Israelites had to gradually get that technology from the Philistines. So in the first part of the Iron Age, the Iron 1 that we're especially concentrating on tonight, Palestine is almost in isolation for a couple hundred years. There's some Egyptian influence. Let me read you a passage from Joshua 17 that I think gives you the flavor of the Iron Age, of the Iron 1 period. And this is where they're dividing up the territory. And the people of Joseph said to Joshua, "Why have you given us only one allotment and one portion for an inheritance? We are a numerous people, and the Lord has blessed us abundantly." So they're complaining that they don't have enough room. Joshua says, "If you are so numerous, and if the hill country of Ephraim is too small for you, go up into the forest and clear land for yourselves. They're in the land of the Perizzites and the Rephaites." So if you want to know why there are not that many forests, it's because when people came in the Iron Age and there wasn't enough room in the land that was already tilled, they just went and cleared some more forests. And we've got some evidence for that even here in our area. And the people of Joseph replied, "The hill country is not enough for us. And all the Canaanites who live in the plain have iron chariots, both those in Bethshan and its settlements and those in the valley of Jezreel." But Joshua said to the house of Joseph, to Ephraim and Manasseh, "You are numerous and very powerful. You will not only have one allotment, but the forested hill country as well. Clear it, and its furthest limits will be yours. So the Canaanites will have iron chariots, and though they are strong, you can drive them out." So I think that gives you a little flavor for what this period was like. They had to clear the land if they wanted to live there. They couldn't go down into the plains area because the Canaanites had the chariots, and they had the iron and so on, and they didn't have this kind of technology. Well, this period is well known for collar rim store jars. We found a lot of collar rim store jars at Ameri, and at first it was thought that was characteristic of Israelites on the other side, but now we know it's characteristic of the period. and not of an ethnic group. The same probably goes for a 4-room house. They may have that over at Jalul, I don't know. We certainly have it at Ameri and in many other sites. National scripts began to develop during this time. A lot more can be said about Iron 2 next time. The United Monarchy, depending on where you put it, is fairly well known, especially the Jerusalem area, Solomonic gates, casemate walls, the water systems that are characteristic of this period. If we were to think about some of the type sites for the Iron Age, up north especially, Dan and Hatzor, coming down into the Jezreel Valley, Megiddo and Tanakh, and then coming down into the northern hill country, you have Samaria and Shechem and Tel Farah north. Those are sort of all extremely important sites for the Iron Age. If you go down along the coast in the Philistine area, you have Ashdod, and inland a little ways, Ekron, which is Tel Mikneh, supposedly now, which is being excavated. A lot of interesting Iron Age stuff. Inland a little ways, Lachish and Tel Beit Mirsam, and then in the desert, Beersheba and Arad. And there are definitely zones where the pottery is different, the culture is different. Some people try to connect them to the tribes that lived over there, even on this side. When you come over on this side, starting down in the south, you have Tel Khalifa, which Glick excavated very near Aqaba, where a lot of us were. It's right on the border right now, so we weren't able to visit. Further north, around Petra, where we were, Becerra, Tawilan, Oma Biara are sites that mostly Iron 2, but Jim Sauer, for instance, thinks that in some of the pottery that's been published, there's earlier material. If you move on north to the Moabite area, where the capital is Kerak, you have Diban, Belua, where the stele is found, the Medenas, which some of us visited, were struck by how comparable in some ways it was to Ameri, with the moat and the ramparts and so forth, but all made out of rock. Then you come up into the Ammonite period, or area, and you have Amman, of course, surrounded by the Rujums, some of them, a couple of Rujum Malfus, towers that we've already talked about. Our own project makes a special contribution, Hesban, Ameri, Jawa, and Jalul. You'll hear about those. If you go down into the Jordan Valley to that zone, you have Mazar and Tel Der Allah, where Franken worked. And the north, in the Gilead area, is not nearly as well known, though long ago Paul Lapp excavated at Rumayt, thought to be Ramoth Gilead. I don't know of any really big major sites where Iron 1 is prominent. Is there a clue? Have we found Iron 1? No, it's Bronze Age. So, but there are lots more tells, a lot more material, and we're getting into a better known period than much of what we've had before.
To carry that on, this regionalization that we have in the Iron 1 period corresponds to what we find in the book of Judges, the tribal groups here and there. Sometimes they rise in prominence, sometimes they fall. And so you have villages here, then villages there, or towns here, towns there. Always there were Canaanite cities out in the coastal plain and in the Jordan Valley. But the hill countries of Palestine, the hill country of Palestine and the hill country of Jordan were largely set aside, I shouldn't say set aside, but used by simple farming kind of people of tribal connection. Okay, how does Ameri fit into this? Last week, we stopped with the end of the Middle Bronze Age, right? Because I said the Late Bronze Age we have at Ameri is so late, actually, it's the beginning of the Iron 1. It's not Iron 1, it's LB still. But I think that our LB settlement is the beginning of the settlement process of the people that would grow into our fantastic site of the early Iron 1, with the dry moat, the rampart, the casemate wall, the buildings that we're finding walls over 2 meters high too. Okay, those of you digging through that brick know what we're talking about, or soon to be digging through it. Okay, this is the stuff we're talking about tonight. All right, it represents quite a unique city, I've found out. First of all, the pottery we have from the destruction layer and from the rampart that Bob and Ted are, and now Jim are banging through, all comes from about the same time. And the late Bronze Age pottery that we have is just a little bit earlier than it. In fact, in our Iron 1 levels, we still have some pottery that is produced in the late Bronze levels, like biconical jugs and other unique and interesting types of vessels. So I think our city was built in about the mid-13th century, the very end of the late Bronze Age, with our late Bronze layer. Then we have, in fields A and B so far, an early level of Iron 1 that I think probably is late 13th century up to about 1200. And finally, our big phase that we're all digging through right now, the one that was destroyed so massively, which I think is right around 1200 and may be destroyed in the early part of the 12th century. So our whole settlement may have been, over 3 phases, may have been only about 75 years, maximum, I think, 100. At any rate, the pottery that we have from the destruction layer itself, and that you're setting on the tables down there, is some of the earliest Iron 1 pottery I can find anywhere. Now, when I say that, you have to divide up the other sites in this area. There's zones. On the coastal plain, we of course have Philistine pottery. Maybe they're a little later too. But we also have what is called Canaanite city-states, the big urban centers. Megiddo, right? Bethshan, where some people have been. And other cities like that were different. They have different kinds of vessels, a great variety of them. Our site is quite limited. You hear me always say pithos, cooking pot, maybe even rarely bowl, or once in a while we found today a pixos, right? Wonderful, beautiful paint and all that. Rarely nice things. Our pottery fits the corpus, the assemblage of pottery, not from the coastal plain urban centers, but from the small villages that are found in the hill country of Palestine, especially north of Jerusalem. South of Jerusalem, the villages are later, 11th century. Maybe one is earlier. And that's the area of Judah. To the north, we get some earlier ones. Our pottery is as early as the earliest of those. And so it's quite amazing then, when instead of a little village with 3 or 4 houses, we find a honkin' city, right? I mean, it's not a real big one, but it's fortified with the largest fortification system I can find anywhere from this time, maybe even on the coastal plain, with the dry moat at the bottom, the rampart, the retaining wall, the rampart, the casemate wall, all that sort of stuff. And so come to find out, we have an extremely important site from the Iron 1, culminating through 2 earlier stages of unfortified materials. And finally, they fortify it with this huge business. Why did they fortify it? Well, read the book of Judges, right? Things are in turmoil. Tribe against tribe. In the Song of Deborah in Judges 5, you have only 10 tribes of Israel listed, and 6 of them are blessed for joining them, 4 of them are cursed for not joining them. And everybody in Transjordan, I think, except Manasseh, I think, was cursed for not joining them. So sometimes you're a bad guy, sometimes you're a good guy. This is the tribal confederacy of Israel, anyway, had a great centrifugal force pulling it apart. I imagine there were other tribal confederacies as well. Maybe one that culminated ultimately in the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites. And because of similar backgrounds, similar histories, the Bible, which is a story of the Israelites, thinks of these people as relatives. After the middle of the 12th century, at the latest, probably even earlier, after the destruction of Tel el-Ameri, there is we could say a hiatus, right, of nothing. Nobody lived on the site. And so when Kent excavates there, he has late iron 2, and what's under late iron 2? The bricks of the destruction already, just like that. Now he skipped there. Apparently they didn't build houses there. The early iron 2 stuff that we do have in the 9th century, maybe the very latest end of the 10th, but into the 9th century, we have some other Iron Age stuff from Field A and Field F, but that's just a little brief stutter, and that's for iron 2 times anyway.
Yeah, I don't have as much to say as Larry. He gave a nice summary. Since we've only been excavating at Jewel for 2 seasons, we don't have a lot to say about that. And our stratigraphy isn't as nicely hewn and divided as Larry's been able to do at Umeri. We do know from both the surface shirting and what we've dug up so far, both last season and this season, that there was definite late Bronze Age pottery there. We have the biconical jugs like you have. The interesting question will be to see how closely they tie into what you're finding, and do they actually bleed into the Iron 1. We don't have any good stratigraphy from that period yet, or any architectural tie-ins to say for sure, but we have biconical jugs. We have the typical bichrome kind of pottery on sort of a light cream slip that is sometimes associated with the late Bronze Age. So we know we have that period. We also have Iron 1 pottery. Again, no architecture yet like they're having at Umeri. We have, again, the carinated bowls from the Iron 1 are one of our not real frequent forms, but we're getting it enough to know that it's there.
You had one today.
We had one today that you walked by. In fact, we had a couple. One that I sent up to you and one that we read at the table. Kind of a reddish, an unusual color for the carinated bowl. We're also getting a lot of the famous collar rim jars that Dr. Garrity mentioned, making the big question about the ethnic tie-in to these things even more problematic. Jalul is situated in an interesting geographical location. According to extra-biblical and biblical data, it was possibly occupied by as many as 4 groups, major groups, and who knows how many subgroups. You have Amorites in that region, you have Ammonites, and you have Israelites, particularly the tribe of Reuben, and you have, of course, the Moabites, all vying for control of this region. And so it represents a real interesting possible insight to the question of whether we can tie material culture in very tightly with ethnicity. Right now we're just getting started, so it's very hard to say. But we do know we've got the late bronze, we know we have the Iron Age and those collar rim jars, and we also seem to see a sequence in the collar rim jars from the Iron 1 on into the Iron 2. And that's very intriguing as well. They seem to go down a little further over here than what had commonly been understood previously over in the West Bank. So we seem to have some kind of continuity in occupation. Unfortunately, again, we don't have enough knowledge from Jalul to see whether we've got gaps, such as you're saying. Maybe there's no earlier late Bronze Age occupation. Do you know yet whether that's occurring? Is it just the late?
It seems to be.
The latter part. We can't speak for certainty yet because we just don't have enough material. So can we talk about settlement continuity at Jalul from LB to Iron 1? I think so, but we're not really as certain as perhaps at Umeri. Will there be a little bit of a lag? Dr. LaBianca and I have worked on another paper looking at settlement patterns, and there does seem to be a tendency for people in the north, and maybe he talked about this or we'll talk about it, but there seems to be a tendency for people in the north, particularly in Ammon and Gilead, to settle down first because of the more advantageous environmental conditions. And there might be a chronological lag in any of these periods heading from north to south. There's more rainfall in the north, more trees in the north, soil conditions are better north, so that when political situation is conducive to settlement, you're going to see people settling down here first, and that peace dividend may actually work its way down south. So will there be a little lag at Jalul from Umeri? We really don't know. They're awfully close together. so we may not see too much of a lag. Maybe they're virtually contemporaneous. So that's something we'll be looking for, is that seam between the late Bronze Age and the Iron Age. How far through the Iron 1 period we go, we don't know. We seem to be having a lot of Iron 1 pottery from different periods, but again, it's not fine enough to say how far down. We do have very early Iron 2, such as Umeri has. Most of you have heard about the discussion of our 2 paved rampways going up to what we hope will be a gate. We still haven't quite located that, but that upper rampway was in the middle Iron 2, but the lower one seems to be the very earliest Iron 2, and right under it, in fact, for a couple of weeks of last season, we were finding so many collar rim jars and carinated bowls, and they were all in a very ashy material, burnt. It appeared to me that there was a very major destruction, not in the early part of the Iron 1 like Dr. Ur has at Umeri, but in the very late part of the Iron 1 we thought we had a massive destruction. The ash was over 1 meter thick in places. And so there seemed to be some kind of a major disruption temporarily between Iron 1 and Iron 2. At the very end of the season, though, we found about 4 sherds that were very early Iron 2 in Jim Fisher's area. So now we've redated that pavement to the very earliest Iron 2. But still, there's so much Iron 1 material, there seems to have been some major destruction of the site. Everywhere we did, we seem to find this massive destruction layer. So that kind of gives a general picture of what we're seeing at. How it will fit into social patterns and other things is maybe more than we want to discuss in this brief introduction. Maybe we can come back to that more in our discussion period a little bit later on.
I don't have a great deal to say specifically about Iron 1, but I'd like to say something about the pattern that you've already heard described. We're already seeing cycles of build-up and abandonment of these Umeri. The same applies in the hinterland. And as we look at each of these periods, including Iron 1, there are 5 or 6 attributes of the people in this area that I think are going to be very important to distill and to look to see if we can find archaeological correlates for those attributes. One of the things that has struck me as I worked in Jordan over many years now is a tremendous fluidity of the population, their ability to adapt to many different circumstances. And we've heard Larry has talked about tribes, Randy's talked about tribes, and one of the first important attributes that has allowed this population to be so flexible is their kin-based social network, that is their tribal organization. And it seems that rather than thinking of tribes as being people in the desert, the fact is that in Transjordan, for all the centuries that we have historical record, the center of gravity for local social organization has been the tribal kin-based system. That is even true today. And Fauzi can probably support me that the latest election can even be understood on the basis of tribal solidarities. So while in anthropology there has been some recent attempt to say tribes are not really something that we can define, so we will just simply leave them aside. The fact is, I think it is completely wrong-headed to try to look at the history of Transjordan without appreciating the tremendous flexibility that kin-based local social organization provides. Now, what a tribe provides is a set of privileges. It gives you access to water. A tribe provides access to land, and typically when you belong to a tribe, a tribe will control a varied ecology, so that it includes a wetter area and a drier area. And that gives the tribe some ability to move either into the areas of their springs or into areas of better rainfalls. A tribe also maintains among its members a variety of agro-pastoral strategies. Some people are more pastoral, some more agricultural. And within one tribe even, you will have some that emphasize more one than the other. Now, as we look at the Iron 1 period, one of the things that I'm looking at, and I think all of us will be interested in, is what can we say about the technological material correlates of this? Well, we know, for example, from Hespan in the Iron Age, we haven't really studied the bones yet in depth by period from our sites here. But we know there was a lot more, as we enter in through the Iron Age period, through the Iron 1 to the Iron 2, we get a gradual buildup of draft animals, especially in Iron 2, from mostly sheep and goat and textile industry. That is, in the Iron 1 at Hespan, you have a lot of spindle whorls and an enormous amount of sheep and goat remains. In Iron 2, we get a lot more cattle, and the cattle go along with the draft animals that you can imagine as the agricultural cycle intensifies. So you see a shift here in the technology that very likely reflects, that is in fact reflected in other ways. Just a couple of other things about the tribe, and then we can come back to it. So a tribe, as a tribe settles, so as we move from Iron 1 to Iron 2, that we can expect that the tribe will move from being what we call range tied. That is, that they're tied to a broad area that they have access to, but they may not control the land individually, toward becoming land tied. That is where, as people settle and plant a tree or put down their houses, they become more concerned about specifically owning a piece of land. In Jordan, in the past 100 years, they have moved from being more range tied to being land tied. And even as we are trying to get permits to work in the land, we are still finding that in much of the land, even in this area, is owned by groups of brothers. And when you come to actually find out, well, who owns this particular plot where we're going to dig? Well, they all own it. And so who do you really go to? And they're still sorting it out. So in some places where you see the fences are all marked, the privatization of property is complete. But in other places, like at Rufais, to our consternation, there's still some discussion as to who owns Kirbet Rufais. Is it really Azi Abu Jaber? Or is it one of his brothers? I was amazed to find out that that is still an issue, because there's still not all the land has been brought under the rigid control of private control of land that you must have for intensive forms of agriculture. So the shift we will see from Iron 1 to Iron 2 is a shift that involves greater movement toward land tiedness. As that happens, tribes become less flexible, and we will talk more about that later. So now finally, it's...
Okay, Gary, go ahead and take a few minutes. Maybe we'll go to
Okay, just a few things. Getting away from politics and tribes, let's talk about the relationship between man and the environment. And that's what I'm mostly interested in. And in a very basic way, the Umeri survey area is split right down the middle, and you can see the airport highway as that split. Everything to the east is fairly open and easily accessible, unless you're looking for Site 18, which doesn't seem to be easily accessible anymore. Yeah, I chose an alternate route to Site 18 today. Everything west of the highway is more difficult terrain. The hills are steeper, the valleys are deeper, and it's just more difficult to get around. Consequently, when people start to settle an area, they generally choose that part that's easiest to get to and easiest to use. And so with the beginning of the Iron Age in Iron 1, most of the settlement is taking place to the east of the airport highway. In these sort of open areas, they don't need to terrace the landside or the hill slopes to farm. They can just farm in the wadi bottoms or on the gentle slopes. They build their structures, whatever they are, about midway on these slopes, sometimes a little more towards the top, depending. The second thing to know about Iron 1, I guess, is that there aren't very many sites that have Iron 1 pottery. We've got about 135 sites now in the Umeri region, and of those, about 19 of them had Iron 1 pottery. However, that's a big jump from late bronze, when we have no pottery. Not even one sherd from the whole region is late bronze. We have, I think, 2 sites that have middle bronze pottery. So the Iron 1, although there's not a whole lot of sites, it's a big jump from the Bronze Ages, especially the late Bronze Age.
Is it too early to compare Jalul yet with the Umeri?
No.
Is that what you can do?
Jalul has nothing, to put it mildly.
That's a hinterland, mind you.
Yeah, the Tell has a lot of stuff, but the hinterland has nothing. We find we've done about somewhere between 30 and 40 random squares now, and we have 4 sites. The first season in the UMERI survey, they did 40 random squares, and they had 55 sites. So there's a big difference between the 2 regions. I mean, basically, there's nothing out there. And this will probably be the last season for the Jalil survey. But when you look at sites in the UMERI region, you want to, what I try and do is build what I'm calling an environmental signature for these sites. What is the environment like at these sites? And in the Iron 1 period, this is a fairly specific thing. And it has to do with elevation and slopes and soil types, and I won't go into it, but it's a fairly specific environmental signature, and you can sort of predict where you're going to find Iron 1 sites based on this signature. And next week when we talk about Iron 2, we'll see a shift. Instead of having a specific signature, there's basically no signature. You find Iron 2 pottery everywhere. And this speaks of the difference between the 2 periods. There is, when Iron 2 comes, there's more people, and they are sort of forced out of the comfort zones that they've had before, and they have to go elsewhere. So this brings in new technologies such as terracing and other things. And I think I'll leave that till we talk about Iron 2, perhaps. So I guess that's it for survey.
Tui and I talked at dinner time, and really the comments that she would like to make about the kinds of figurines and so on, you were thinking about whether or not we should talk about them now or with the Iron 2. It's kind of transitional. So whatever comments you'd like to make, Tui.
Maybe we'll talk about figurines again with Iron 2, but when Stan was talking about the tribal system, what occurred to me is, maybe this occurred to you too, many people who do critical study of the Genesis narratives about the ancestors say that they were edited at this particular time in Iron 1. And they were edited to tell the story of the ancestors of our people and our relatives. So that if you follow this line of thinking, if one of the things we want to do in establishing our tribal identity is to tell the story of our ancestors, we would use kernels of historical memory, but weave them together so that we see the family relationships of the people that we live near now. And when we do that, for example, with say the story having to do with Isaac and Rebekah, we might want to look very, very closely at objects that are mentioned in these narratives. The story of Isaac and Rebekah has some very interesting details that relate to Rebekah as the choice of wife for Isaac, who will have leadership in this tribal entity. And what is wonderful about Rebekah? Why is she thought of as a great ancestor? We know that she is going to be considered as very, very important. And one of the insignia of her importance is the wedding jewelry she receives. Over and over again in that chapter, about 3, sometimes even 4 times, the account is mentioned of the jewelry that Abraham's servant brings for Rebekah to put on particular parts of the body. Very, very particular parts of the body. She will wear this wedding jewelry that is the insignia of her marriage to Isaac and her leadership as an ancestress. But what does she do really in that story? Well, the main thing that she does is to provide water for camels within a pastoral setting. She's watering sheep mainly. And she seems to be doing it well, but what's so remarkable about that particular narrative is that a lot of people think that camels don't really come in to use until around the time of Judges and Gideon and the Midianites. So maybe there's a little editorialization on the story of Rebecca. She's a wonderful waterer of sheep, so much so that we embroider this story because we're living now in the Iron Age and we now have camels, so we want to emphasize this even more. And what's wonderful about Rebecca is that she waters these 10 camels. Now that's a lot of water coming out of a well, because how much does one camel drink after a long desert journey? About 40 gallons of water. And so what does that say about Rebecca? What is the implication of that? If you know about camels, and you know about watering, and you know that she is a leader in watering sheep, and you know that she is receiving the objects on her body which represent leadership in some way in this tribal entity.
And the 10 camels represent the 10 tribes?
The 10 lost tribes. It's a Mormon story.
These stories emphasize mainly 12 tribes, the number 12, even though sometimes there's a little bit more than 12. Sometimes less. Maybe, but there's something else. What does that say? 400 gallons of water and a lot of sheep and watering all them. What does it say about her?
Quite a fertile mother.
No, so I want to hear it, and I'm not hearing it. I want a word. No?
Machinery.
There's one beginning with A.
Active.
She is a very able administrator. And this is the key scene that gives us a sense of the quality of her leadership. Because obviously she could marshal a great many of the people whose responsibility was for the flocks in this tribal setting, so that in a very short time, 10 camels on top of all the sheep herding things that were going on at that well could be given in a moment 400 gallons of water. So I think that is in miniature a story that involves objects and pottery and tribal anthropological things and bones because of our camels and our sheep, and gives us a clue as to the position of women who are going to have leadership responsibility now in our ancestral heritage.
Okay.
It's better to video.
Speak as loud as you can, please.
Sorry, but I'd like to talk to you about the Amman Citadel, since I have been excavating for a long time. I think you know the Amman Citadel is the hill where the museum, and it extends like an open arm from north to southeast now, in four terraces. Okay? The upper terrace is occupied by a Roman terminus with the Umayyad audience palace. The second terrace is occupied by the what we call the Hercules temple, and the third terrace is where I excavated, called the probably the residential area of the Iron Age period.
You all saw this on the first Sunday, remember, when we went up to the museum? That's the area you talked about.
Now we know that Amman existed in the Iron Age 1, since you are dealing with Iron Age 1, because it's mentioned in the Judge, is mentioned in Samuel 1, for example, and that King David besieged Rabbat Ammon, you see, and he sent his general, and during that Uriah the Hittite was killed, you know, the walls of Amman. All these stories, you know, but when you read the Bible, then Joab, you know, sent a message to David. He says, I occupied the city of water, Ir Hamayim, you see in Hebrew. And then I occupied also Ir HaMelucha, the city of the king. And now come and take the city. He occupied the city of the water, the city of what remained then? Of course, it remained, you know, I think people do not know or are discussing what is, for example, the city of water. You know, people who explain the Bible think that the city of water is the city downtown along the stream of Amman. Well, this is not my opinion. No. This is the city of water is not the city along the stream, because this city need not to be, for example, captured. I mean, Joab was besieging the citadel, not really the city of the downtown city. So if you look, coming from Jebel Hussein, and then you look at the citadel, there is the Roman city wall. Coming from the north, from Jebel Hussein, there is the Roman city wall. And then below the Roman city wall, there is an outcrop, there is a rock now converted into a garden. And this rock, there is a huge cistern, see? And this huge cistern, and around this huge cistern, were found many Ammonite sculpture. Gera Azar and the other sculpture were found around this area. You see, then this means that the city extended beyond the Roman city walls, and this was part of the Iron Age city. And the city of Ir HaMayim, you know, mentioned in the Bible, is not the downtown, but it's that area north of the citadel, because in that area is a huge cistern which communicates with by a tunnel with the city wall. I mean, the people. I mean, this was part of this Ammonite city, and there is this huge cistern. We don't know if it was probably a spring, and that it communicates from the inner or from the citadel with a tunnel. And you know the story of, for example, Antiochus III, who besieged in 218 Amman, and then he could not capture the city until a prisoner showed him the tunnel leading to the cistern, and he closed it, and the cistern there, surrendered from the want of water. So the city of water is, I think, the area in the north, where is the garden, where they now a waterfall, and there's a huge cistern, and there's a tunnel. This is the city of water. Now, Ir HaMelucha, or the city of the king, is the lower terrace where we found, you see, a very good structure of Iron Age 2 and also Iron Age 1. I myself found very good evidence of Iron Age 1 figurines and pottery, and we excavated recently and found, for example, the Middle Bronze wall with a glacis, and then Iron Age wall. We found a little Iron Age 1, in fact, because the city was reoccupied in the Iron Age 2, and the city wall was rebuilt, and then came the Hellenistic period, and also they rebuilt walls, and then until the Roman period. So little remained from the Iron Age 1, but we know it's there. It's with inside the glacis of the Middle Bronze Age. So the Amman citadel is a good evidence for example, the presence of a kingdom, of an Ammonite kingdom in the Iron Age 1 and 2, probably the kingdom was founded at the end of the 13th century, since it existed in the book of Judges, and was destroyed by the Neo-Babylonian conquest in 586 BC, you know, same time as Jerusalem. So I hope if I go one time with you to the citadel to show you the different problems of the citadel and the different walls of the citadel. Otherwise, I hope one day we'll have the chance to show you the citadel hill. So, thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, it's open. Questions from you. You may have some things to talk about. It's getting cool. Make your questions quick, I suppose. Not that quick. Okay, Carolyn. Yes.
I'll repeat a variation of the question I asked
Loud,
when you.
please.
I'll repeat a variation of the question I asked when you were discussing Bronze Age. And I'm intrigued by Sten's idea of these as being kind of tribal centers. To think of Umeri as a tribal center somehow stretches me into thought patterns I'm not used to. It's not supposed to be a tribal thing. It's supposed to be a city. But anyway. But even given that, why is so much of this settlement taken up by this, you know, again, it's not a huge settlement. Why is so much of it taken up with those defense systems?
You're asking me?
Yes.
Okay, she
anyone.
asked, if you didn't hear, why at Umeri is so much space used for the defensive system if the settlement inside is relatively small. It's only at the largest a hectare and a half, which is what, about 6 acres, the area inside. And so why did all that work go into fortifying such a small settlement?
May I try and answer?
In a tribal sort of situation.
Wrap it up with another question. Does the survey evidence of Iron 1 give any suggestion that there's a settlement hierarchy in this area?
Yeah.
Not really. It's difficult. It's yes and no. Iron 1 material is pretty sparse. Iron 2 material, of course, is much greater. I mean, it's easier to see the hierarchy in Iron 2. Iron 1, there's not really, 19 sites, it's hard to tell if there's a hierarchy with that many sites. Personally, I think they're all afraid of the guys in the hinterland, though, just like they are today up on the town.
That's because they're running around in jeeps.
True ethnography.
But I think that this all supports the idea that even though the Ammonites, even in the Iron 1, were a kingdom, we must not think of it as a kingdom in the sense of the kings of Europe. This was a tribal kingdom, and at best in the early Iron Age, I imagine you had a very localized kingdom, and maybe this, you might have had the beginnings of a, if not a king, a sort of a proto, a grand chef, or proto-king at Umeri, who in fact had other tribes with which he had to be concerned, and of course at the same time, I've mentioned that the tribal entity is important for understanding local level social organization. But remember that we are also on this land bridge between Europe, Asia and Africa, where there are also threats from both recent abatement of Egyptian power and a tremendous rise in power from the east. And so with these things working together, both the threat of local tribal groups and the geopolitical situation in the larger region, one can begin to see why there might have been these large walls. And then later on, as the monarchy established itself, people more readily inhabit the hinterland. You had tremendous growth of farmsteads and so forth.
Let me ask a follow-up question on that then. What kind of system are you talking about? If they're not little hinterland sites in the Iron 1 on some kind of village level, and yet we see in this tremendous amount of storage pottery with these big pithoi and big store jars and stuff, I presume they're largely storing grain and things like that in fairly large quantities.
Well, the
Where's
thing
it
is,
coming from?
the thing is, Carolyn. First of all, the first two phases, the LB one at Ameri and the first Iron 1 phase, were probably unfortified. Those were smallish. All right. For some reason, they felt like they had to put these great, big, huge, massive fortifications there. Now, the interesting thing is that Ameri is on the King's Highway, where trade moved. One thesis I've been toying around with is that these people there at Ameri wanted a part of that trade and started to block a trade route and say, hey, we want this money. Now, they knew when they started doing that what would happen. The people who operated the trade routes wouldn't tolerate that, and they'd amass all their tribal coalition to come against this group to cut that block.
But the question becomes, in what trade?
That's one possibility.
I mean, look, Larry already started out by telling us about the fall off of trade during the late Bronze Age. You know, you didn't mention your alabaster. You got this wonderful alabaster jar, which let's assume that it's in its situation there. And it's not foreign from a later time, that it's an Egyptian product. And I mean, the whole question of Egypt's concern with this part of the world, I think, is quite appropriate.
Yeah, okay. David has brought up Egypt here. This is the period of Egypt's decline, however, in Palestine. In fact, it's because of their weakness that the Philistines are able to occupy the coastal plain. And in fact, the Egyptians just sort of tolerate them and try to limit them. But soon the Egyptians go away, and the Philistines have freedom to go up into the hill country and hassle the Israelites too.
When you push it early the way you've got it pushed, though, you've got almost the apogee of Egyptian influence in Palestine with Ramses II and Meneptah. When you go to 1150, then, you know, Ramses VI, that's the last one. But that 12th century turn there, that's really
There was also just the fact of when people settled after a period of primarily range ownership. That is, there's very little private ownership of individual land. When people settle and become more or less sitting ducks, we've had mostly a pastoral, a low intensity late Bronze Age, with mostly pastoral and agro-pastoral cave villages, I would posit. We haven't found many of them yet. But then they settle, just like as Rauf Abu Jaber and the Bisharats. They build fortified farmsteads at the end of the Ottoman period because they're one of the few, more or less, people committed to a sedentary way of life. And they have a lot to be worried about because most people don't like for their pasture lands to be tied up with agriculture. And so there is a kind of a inherent conflict between people who want to settle and privatize lands, especially if those lands have been under the range control of another group. And that actually happens at the beginning of the Roman period, that is at the beginning of the Hellenistic Roman intensification phase. Likewise at the beginning of the Ayyubid Mamluk, you get tremendous concern with fortification and protection at the beginning of each intensification cycle in this region. So it is nothing new in the Iron Age. It is just it's repeated for every subsequent period.
But another point is, Tel el-Ameri needed those fortifications, but they weren't good enough. They weren't good enough. They got blasted right away. And it wasn't even a long siege, because we have bushels of barley grains, we have shanks of Elsie and Mr. Ed, both with butcher marks.
Shanks of Mr. Ed?
Shanks of Mr. Ed with butcher marks, yeah.
And Proto.
And so these people weren't hungry. It wasn't a siege. They got zapped right away.
Describe the two Medenas and what you saw
Yeah,
there,
okay.
and compare them to Ameri.
On a trip we took there in Moab region, near where Fauzi is from. In fact, Smakia was our base for going out. Our two important Iron One sites, both of which had a dry moat, both of which were on a ridge extending out from the hills, just like Ameri is. Okay, the bedrock is very low at Ameri, you know, and both were cut with dry moats, like Ameri is. They didn't have earthen ramparts, I don't think, but they had towers right there by the moat to protect them. And they were built of huge stones. I pity the excavator of those sites to move those big stones. The difference, one major difference is I think they're 11th century and not late 13th and 12th century. So I think they're quite a bit later, and actually were not around when Ameri was. Yeah, end of the Iron One. Yeah, so 11th and 10th century. Yeah, they are copycats. But it's not Ameri, they are not part of a trend, which Ameri was part of. If anything, Ameri is so far known in Jordan as the leader in this sort of stuff. Medina, they're called.
Both. Alia is to the south.
The south, yeah.
Medina Maraj is to the north. There's two Medina. Medina is Harbi.
You were waiting for them.
Just one quick comment that might be of interest to people, and it relates to Carolyn's first comment about I can't imagine these weren't cities, or that this wasn't a kingdom or a state. This is something Will Sten and I have been working on together. And just for the fun of it, you might like to hear a description of a non-state society elsewhere. I made this presentation that there were no states in Transjordan in the Iron Age, and I got blasted by ants and rain. Everyone around here is paranoid about that, but just listen to this description. This is the Olmec culture in Mesoamerica, which is dated 1200 to 400 BC. So it's roughly contemporaneous with the time period we're working in. In this society, you have hieroglyphic writing, astronomical observation, monumental architecture, planned ceremonial religious centers, specialization in art and craft, intensive irrigation agriculture. The monumental architecture includes, at one site, 60 stone monuments, including colossal heads over 3 meters high, large freestanding sculptures carved out of massive basalt rocks. Some of these monuments were cut out of blocks weighing as much as 40 metric tons. Think about that. If we found that here in Ameri or in Jalul or anywhere in this part, they were imported from 80 kilometers away. In fact, everything about this society would actually be almost comparable with Egypt, and yet anthropologists who are looking at reconstructing the social structure do not describe this as a state. It is a sub-state society, closer to a chiefdom or tribal society. And so the point is that massive monumental architecture, fortifications, trade, those things do not a state or a complex society make. And this is something we're trying to get Syro-Palestinianists to look at, to get in tune with what other anthropologists throughout the world are doing. Even somebody was saying, well, Moab, Mesha the king made roads. That makes this a state. He must be a king, and he must be a king of a big state. In the Southwest, where several of us are training at Arizona, you have the Southwest Indian culture, and they have over 600 kilometers of roads connecting over 125 towns. That is considered a sub-state society. Road systems, none of these things make a state, and I think we have to re-educate ourselves into thinking, what is a state? And that's a topic maybe for another discussion. This is an important society. Tribal society is very dynamic, very flexible, very resilient, but it's not necessarily a state in the way that we think of in the West. I think re-educate ourselves.
United Tribes of America.
United Tribes of America.
Excuse me, but you were talking about tribes. I think we have to think of the Ammonite kingdom as really a feudal kingdom, like the medieval period, where you have why all these towers, you know, what do you call these towers around Amman? There's more than 18 or 20 towers.
Right.
So these were not really for the defense of Amman, because some of them are located in very low country. These were feudal towers with probably landowners, you know, which were to supervise the land around, you know. So we have to think of the Ammonite kingdom as a kingdom and as a feudal kingdom with tribe sheikhs, you know.
Yeah.
Each of them has its territory and has its tower to protect.
I think that's a good step in the right direction, and it gets us out of the other framework. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I think we're about out of time. I want to thank everyone, participants here today.